principle affirms and promotes justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Now, there are obviously many powerful words in that principle that deserve to be unpacked. But it seems to me that there is clearly one word in that statement of utmost importance, a word that stands out above and beyond its counterparts. The word that I think ties together the entire thing, and that word is human. The second principle requires us to show justice, equity, and compassion only in human relations. In other words, the second principle doesn't apply to animals. So that little modifier, human, is what allows me to continue to eat delicious lesser species without having to violate my faith. I say that in partial jest. There are several UUs, of course, who choose to extend these values to animals and believe absolutely that our faith calls us to more just, equitable, and compassionate relationships with all living creatures. And the nice thing is that because these 7 principles are democratic expressions of our collective faith, rather than, say, divine, immutable commandments from the mouth of God, they are dynamic and open to adjustment over time. It may very well be the case that someday, sooner rather than later, we will see our principles explicitly incorporate such language toward animals. However, I will say that if and when that day comes, we might need to also borrow from our Catholic friends the confessional booth for our churches, because I'm going to need to probably use that every week until I can kind of become fully vegetarian myself, which I am working on, and my wife is helping me out a lot. But today, at least, until that day does come, today I'm going to be focusing on human relations and the 3 values that are explicitly listed in that second principle: justice, equity, and compassion. So let us take a look at each in turn. We start, of course, with justice. And frankly, we could do an entire sermon series on the concept of justice alone. If there could be only one cardinal virtue of Unitarian Universalism, my vote would be for justice. I can think of no better way to spend my limited days here on earth than pursuing and incarnating justice. That, to me, would be a life well spent. But what exactly is justice? Here we again run into that problem I highlighted the last time I spoke here when I introduced the 7 principles, the problem of vagueness. Sometimes our principles feel like a lot of beautiful words that lack definition, which then ensures that we can never really be certain that we're all talking about the same thing. Perhaps that's by design. But the word justice, it means different things to different people. And I imagine that on some basic level, most of us would have to agree, though, that justice has at least something to do with ideas of morality, basic fairness, and every person receiving what they ultimately deserve. But I fear that justice is too narrowly defined by most Americans. Many in this nation view justice primarily as being concerned with the punishment of criminals rather than the eradication of systematic inequalities. Now, a place that I like to go sometimes to try to capture the spirit of the times is comic books. I really do believe that comic books are a sort of self-aware modern mythology that we create in any culture, and obviously here in America. So in comic books, in the DC comic universe, there is a famous superhero group known as the Justice League. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, all the All-Stars, they're all members of this team. So what exactly does this so-called Justice League do? Seek to eradicate institutionalized poverty? Bring an end to the ever-expanding prison industrial complex? Fight against homophobia and transphobia? Do their comics and movies show them working to close the racial achievement gap or eliminate wage inequality between men and women? Do they work to stop corporations from creating ecological catastrophes that disproportionately affect the poor? By and large, the answer is no. Primarily, the Justice League is about catching bad guys. And for too many in this country, That is really all that justice represents, catching bad guys. Much of our citizenry ignores the systemic inequalities that create bad guys in the first place, that help to define who is bad, and prescribes exactly what will happen to these bad guys, which in this country usually ends up perpetuating the systems of inequality and oppression that created the so-called bad guys in the first place. There is nothing just about such a system. So I prefer that definition of justice, which declares it to be love in action. Such a definition echoes the sentiments of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who once said, "It is not enough for us to talk about love. Love is one of the pivotal points of the Christian faith. There is another side called justice." So justice is love correcting that which revolts against love. In understanding justice as love in action, or as love's revolution, then we also come to understand with greater clarity the relationship that exists between justice and the law. There is no relationship. All right, that might be slightly hyperbolic, but I kind of mean it. As some of you may be aware, I have a law degree, and in my previous legal studies, perhaps the most important lesson I learned in all those years of law school was that the creation of laws has less to do with establishing justice than with preserving order. And often the greatest impediment to justice, the source of the greatest resistance, comes from those otherwise good people who, again, in the words of the Reverend Dr. King, are more devoted to order than justice. Because such order is an artificial harmony. It is a false peace. Those devoted to such order, harmony, and peace are often afraid of change, transformation, and revolution, even when that revolution is founded in love. Those who prioritize order over justice are fearful of the messiness and the chaos that necessarily accompany the move from injustice toward justice. They have a distaste for civil disobedience, which is the intentional breaking of unjust laws. They are fearful of the unruliness and unpredictability of large crowds of protesters and marchers. And because those who value order over justice are often those occupying a place of privilege in our society, they are also afraid of what they personally stand to lose if we become a more just society. Those in a society who have something to lose will always fear those who have nothing to lose. And the easy answer has always been to simply lock them up. That is why America, the putative land of the free, has more prisoners than any other country on earth. The harder answer, the real solution, which would move us closer to justice, is to restructure our society so that everyone has something to lose. But of course, that would entail providing true equality of opportunity to everyone. That would entail a real war on poverty rather than a war on the poor. That would entail a revolution of love. So in other words, justice. If greater justice is to be born in this nation like any birth, there will be labor pains and there will be messiness. Look at history. Every birth of greater justice in this nation was accompanied by those elements. Now the good news is, I think at least, that we as a nation, we are actually on the cusp of witnessing another birth of justice. But the bad news is, like always, it's going to hurt. And in order to get to justice, we may need to recalibrate our values. And that is where equity comes in. Now, equity is not the same thing as equality. In America, we tend to be more familiar with the concept of equality. It's really an aspirational ideal that everything be equal and fair for all. Now, equity is also interested in fairness, but it draws a distinction from equality in this sense. Equality can be defined to suggest that fairness is treating everyone exactly the same no matter what. Equity takes a more nuanced approach. Equity recognizes that not everyone begins equally situated because there are significant inequalities between individuals and peoples in this country. So recognizing this fact, equity argues that it is actually unfair to treat all people exactly the same way. As the famous metaphor suggests, if every runner started the race at completely different points on the track, it's unfair to expect those who started further back to be able to compete with those who started closer to the finish line. Another way of saying this, treating everyone exactly the same is totally fair, but only if everyone is the same in the most important ways. But if everyone is different, then treating them all the same will inevitably lead to some people having an unfair advantage over others. Now, one of the most ready examples of this, of equity, is affirmative action. In a nutshell, affirmative action programs incentivize the hiring of women and minorities who have historically been subject to systemic discrimination. The argument goes that women and people of color, and especially Black Americans, have long been institutionally disadvantaged when it comes to being fairly considered for certain jobs. So affirmative action treats women and minorities differently in an attempt to fairly balance the unequal treatment they have received for centuries that led to them being unfairly disadvantaged in the job pool as compared to their white male counterparts. Now, the specific mechanics of affirmative action and the disadvantages that also naturally accrue from such a system are open, I think, to fair critique and debate. But the spirit animating the policy reflects a desire for basic fairness and justice by recognizing that not all of us begin the race similarly situated, that many in this nation are disadvantaged simply because of who they are. Now, for an opposite example, where equality results in unfairness, let us consider the case of laws of allegedly equal application that end up disproportionately punishing those who are already oppressed and marginalized. This idea perfectly captures the war on drugs. From the beginning, the war on drugs was a political war waged against Black Americans. The laws that came out of the war on drugs were and are nominally colorblind. That is, they don't explicitly claim that their target is Black people, but historically, that has clearly been the effect, and more than that, it was the intent. In 2016, former President Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, went on record saying the following, quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people." You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. End quote. And the war on drugs is just one example where colorblind laws of equal application were intentionally used to create unequal discriminatory results and to thus perpetuate further inequality. All of us here have likely seen that famous symbol, the statue of Lady Justice. She holds scales and a sword in her hand, and perhaps most importantly, she is blindfolded. I have always been somewhat ambivalent about that blindfold. Now, obviously, the blindfold is meant to symbolize that justice is no respecter of persons, but it can also be problematic for other reasons. Perhaps one way of thinking about what I'm saying today could go like this. A blindfolded Lady Justice represents equality before the law. A Lady Justice that has taken her blindfold off represents equity. Our choice to use the word equity instead of equality in our UU second principle, it means something. It is evidence that we as UUs will not be willfully blind when it comes to recognizing that there remain inequalities all across our land based simply on who you are. Inequalities based on race, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and national origin. We aspire for all people to be equal in the eyes of the law and the eyes of society, but we are not there yet. And to pretend that we are is an affront to justice. Finally today, compassion. Compassion is another one of those words that suffers, so to speak, from having multiple definitions. Some define it narrowly, others more broadly. It is a concept that has been explored extensively in both religious contexts and the sciences. Compassion, or some other synonym, makes an appearance in just about every religious system on earth. But it is perhaps most strongly associated with Buddhism. And so for this morning, my operational definition of compassion will come from the Dalai Lama, who I happily note is more than just a scholar on the topic, he is also a practitioner. He writes, according to Buddhism, compassion is an aspiration, a state of mind wanting others to be free from suffering. It's not passive, it's not empathy alone, but rather an empathetic altruism that actively strives to free others from suffering. Genuine compassion must have both wisdom and loving kindness. That is to say, one must understand the nature of the suffering from which we wish to free others. This is wisdom. And one must experience the deep intimacy and empathy with others that are sentient beings. This is loving kindness. So as I understand these words, compassion calls us to empathetically respond to the suffering of others and then act to end that suffering. If compassion calls us to feel and respond to the suffering of others, then compassion is unattainable if we refuse to look upon, listen to, or expose ourselves to the suffering of others, much like our responsive reading mentioned from earlier this morning. If you want to avoid compassion, then refuse to look at the suffering of others. Conversely, if you want to be compassionate, then you cannot be afraid to look at and see and in some way feel the suffering of others. But your compassion for others must also include compassion for yourself. Be wary of becoming oversaturated with the sorrows of the world, for you will drown if you are not careful. Know when to back away and take care of yourself. That said, on the other hand, there are certainly others who frankly need to dive right in. There are broad swaths of people in our nation who have refused to look at, listen to, and feel the suffering of their oppressed brothers and sisters and siblings, and predictably then there is little compassion in their hearts, thus no action to end that suffering. So this, I believe, brings us full circle. Our faith calls us to serve something greater than ourselves, and for me, just like for many of you, I know that thing greater than myself is justice. A primary tool to achieve true justice is not mere equality, but equity. And the reason we do it all, the motivation that fuels it all, is compassion. When we actually see the suffering of the oppressed, we are necessarily moved to take action to end that suffering and oppression. Thus, compassion moves us towards justice. I noted a few weeks ago when I started this series that I myself am not really a big fan of the 7 principles. But that said, the second principle means a lot to me. It doesn't get enough play, in my humble opinion. So in living your faith this week, I commend all of you. Do justice. Refuse to ignore inequalities, and be not afraid to look upon the suffering of your brothers and sisters and siblings, and in so doing, be moved to act. Amen, and blessed be.